The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the sleek conference room on the 42nd floor of Manhattan's most prestigious business tower. Margaret Williams pushed her cleaning cart down the marble hallway, her worn sneakers making barely a sound against the polished floor. At 63, she had been cleaning offices in this building for nearly 15 years, invisible to most of the powerful people who made million-dollar decisions behind these glass doors. Margaret had seen it all during her night shifts. She had watched companies rise and fall, witnessed hostile takeovers, and overheard conversations that could make or break fortunes. But tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air that made her pause outside Conference Room C, where the lights were still blazing despite the late hour. Through the glass walls, she could see a group of well-dressed executives gathered around a massive mahogany table. At the head sat Richard Blackstone, the infamous corporate raider whose reputation for destroying small businesses was legendary on Wall Street. His silver hair was slicked back, and his cold gray eyes scanned the documents spread before him like a predator examining its prey. Across from Blackstone sat Maria Santos, a young Latina entrepreneur whose innovative food delivery app had been making waves in the tech world. Maria's company, Familia Foods, connected immigrant families with customers seeking authentic home-cooked meals from their cultural backgrounds. What had started as a small operation in Maria's Brooklyn apartment had grown into a multi-million-dollar business that employed thousands of immigrant families across the city. Margaret recognized Maria from the business magazines that sometimes got left behind in the offices she cleaned. The young woman had been featured on several covers, being hailed as the next generation of American entrepreneurs. But tonight, Maria looked exhausted and overwhelmed, her usually bright eyes dulled with stress and uncertainty. Also present were several lawyers in expensive suits, their briefcases overflowing with contracts and legal documents. Margaret noticed how they kept glancing at their watches, clearly eager to finalize whatever deal was being discussed. The tension in the room was palpable, and Margaret could sense that something significant was about to happen. As she began dusting the reception area outside the conference room, Margaret couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation. Blackstone's voice carried clearly through the glass as he spoke in smooth, persuasive tones about market expansion and operational efficiency. His words sounded impressive, but Margaret had heard similar speeches before from men like him. She had witnessed the aftermath of their partnerships firsthand. "Miss Santos," Blackstone was saying, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "this acquisition represents the natural evolution of your company. Familia Foods has tremendous potential, but you lack the infrastructure and capital to compete with the major players in the food delivery market. My corporation can provide the resources you need to take your business to the next level." Maria shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fingers nervously playing with a small cross pendant around her neck. Margaret could see the conflict written across the young woman's face. On one hand, the offer represented financial security and the chance to expand her business beyond her wildest dreams. On the other hand, something about Blackstone's demeanor clearly made her uneasy. "I appreciate your offer, Mr. Blackstone," Maria replied carefully. "But I need to understand exactly what this means for my drivers and the families who cook for us. Familia Foods isn't just a business to me. It's a community. These people depend on this income, and many of them are supporting families back home in their countries of origin." Blackstone waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away an annoying insect. "Business is business, Miss Santos. Emotional attachments to individual contractors will only limit your growth potential. My team has conducted extensive market analysis, and we've identified numerous opportunities for cost reduction and efficiency improvements." Margaret continued her cleaning, but her attention was completely focused on the conversation unfolding in the conference room. She had worked in this building long enough to understand the coded language these corporate executives used. When men like Blackstone talked about cost reduction and efficiency improvements, it usually meant massive layoffs and the elimination of benefits for workers. One of Blackstone's lawyers, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually sneering expression, opened a thick folder and began spreading documents across the table. "These contracts outline the terms of the acquisition," he explained in a nasal voice. Your current business model is quaint, but ultimately unsustainable in today's competitive market. We propose transitioning to a more conventional delivery service model, which will require significant restructuring of your workforce. Margaret felt her blood begin to boil as she listened to the lawyer's clinical description of what amounted to the destruction of Maria's carefully built community. She had seen this same scenario play out countless times over the years. Promising companies with heart and soul would be acquired by soulless corporations, stripped of everything that made them special, and transformed into generic profit machines. Through the glass, Margaret watched as Maria reviewed the contracts with growing concern. The young entrepreneur asked pointed questions about worker protections and benefit preservation, but the lawyers deflected each inquiry with vague promises about transition periods and performance-based evaluations. Margaret could see that Maria was beginning to realize the true nature of what was being proposed. "I'm not sure about this," Maria said finally, pushing the contracts away slightly. "This feels like it goes against everything I built Familia Foods to represent. My drivers aren't just contractors to me. They're partners. Mrs. Chun has been making her grandmother's dumplings through our platform for 3 years. She's been able to send money to her family in China and help her daughter go to college. Mr. Ramirez started selling his mother's tamales to support his disabled wife. These aren't just business relationships." Blackstone's expression hardened slightly, though he maintained his veneer of professional charm. "Miss Santos, I understand your sentimental attachment to your current operations, but sentiment doesn't generate sustainable profits. The market is evolving rapidly, and companies that fail to adapt get left behind. This offer represents a generous valuation of your business, but it won't remain on the table indefinitely." Margaret noticed how Blackstone's tone had shifted from persuasive to subtly threatening. She had heard that tone before from powerful men who were accustomed to getting their way. It was the voice of someone who viewed resistance as nothing more than a temporary obstacle to be overcome. One of the other executives at the table, a woman with sharp features and an aggressive demeanor, leaned forward with a stack of financial projections. "Mr. Blackstone's organization has successfully acquired and optimized dozens of companies in the food service sector," she declared. "Our efficiency models show that we can increase profitability by 40% within the first year of acquisition through strategic workforce optimization and operational streamlining." Margaret knew exactly what those euphemisms meant. Strategic workforce optimization meant firing people to reduce labor costs. Operational streamlining meant eliminating any aspects of the business that didn't directly contribute to maximum profit extraction. She had witnessed the human cost of such optimization firsthand when previous companies in the building had undergone similar transformations. As the meeting continued, Margaret found herself growing increasingly agitated. She watched as the lawyers continued to pressure Maria with complex financial arguments and veiled threats about market competition. They painted a picture of inevitable doom if she didn't accept their offer, while simultaneously presenting the acquisition as her only path to survival and growth. The food delivery market is becoming increasingly dominated by large corporations with significant technological and financial advantages, one of the lawyers explained. Independent operators like yourself are finding it impossible to compete on pricing and service delivery. This acquisition would give you access to our advanced logistics algorithms, marketing resources, and vendor networks. Margaret could see that Maria was beginning to waver under the relentless pressure. The young woman looked tired and overwhelmed, clearly struggling to process all the complex financial information being thrown at her. Margaret knew that this was exactly how predators like Blackstone operated. They created artificial time pressure and information overload to push their targets into making hasty decisions. "I need some time to think about this," Maria said weakly, but Blackstone immediately shook his head. "Unfortunately, time is a luxury we don't have in this situation," he replied smoothly. "Market conditions are changing rapidly, and this offer is contingent on immediate action. My board of directors has authorized this acquisition based on current market valuations, but those numbers could change significantly if we delay." Margaret felt her hands clench into fists as she listened to Blackstone's manipulative tactics. She had seen this exact same scenario play out numerous times over the years, and it always ended the same way. Young entrepreneurs with innovative ideas and genuine care for their communities would be convinced to sign away their life's work to corporate vultures who would immediately strip away everything that made their company special. As the pressure mounted, Margaret noticed that Maria's hands were shaking slightly as she reached for the pen that one of the lawyers had helpfully placed in front of her. The young woman's breathing was shallow, and Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out across her features. On one side was the promise of financial security and business expansion. On the other was the knowledge that accepting the deal would betray the trust of the families who had helped build Familia Foods from the ground up. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning system as Maria stared down at the contract signature page. Blackstone and his team watched her with predatory patience, like wolves waiting for an injured deer to finally collapse. Margaret could feel the weight of the moment, understanding that Maria was about to make a decision that would affect not just her own future, but the lives of thousands of immigrant families who depended on Familia Foods for their livelihood. Margaret had always prided herself on staying invisible and minding her own business during her years of cleaning these offices. She had learned early in her career that getting involved in corporate affairs was a sure way to lose her job. But as she watched Maria's hand tremble over the contract, something inside Margaret snapped. She thought about her own daughter, who had struggled for years to build her small catering business before being forced to close due to competition from large corporate chains. She thought about all the families she had seen destroyed by the greed of men like Blackstone. Without consciously deciding to act, Margaret found herself walking toward the conference room door. Her heart was pounding, and her mouth felt dry, but she knew she couldn't stand by and watch another young entrepreneur get devoured by corporate predators. She thought about all the conversations she had overheard over the years, all the inside information she had accidentally acquired while cleaning around oblivious executives. The silence that followed Margaret's interruption was deafening. Richard Blackstone's face flushed red with anger, and his carefully maintained composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the ruthless predator beneath his polished exterior. The lawyers looked shocked and offended that a cleaning lady had dared to interrupt their important business meeting. Only Maria Santos looked at Margaret with curiosity rather than anger, as if sensing that this unexpected intervention might be exactly what she needed. Security. Blackstone barked, reaching for his phone. I want this woman removed from the premises immediately. This is a private meeting, and we will not tolerate interruptions from the cleaning staff. But Margaret stood her ground, her weathered hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She had spent 15 years being invisible in these corporate corridors, absorbing information and witnessing the destruction caused by men like Blackstone. Tonight, she was finally going to use that knowledge to help someone who deserved better. Wait, Maria said suddenly, holding up her hand to stop Blackstone from making the call. Something in Margaret's voice and demeanor had caught her attention. The young entrepreneur had built her business by trusting her instincts about people, and every instinct was telling her to listen to what this woman had to say. Let her speak. What do you know about this deal? Margaret looked directly at Maria, ignoring the furious stares from Blackstone and his legal team. I know who you are, Miss Santos. I've read about your company in the magazines that get left in these offices. Familia Foods isn't just a business to you. It's about giving immigrant families a chance to make an honest living doing what they know best. It's about building community and preserving culture through food. Maria nodded slowly, surprised that this custodian seemed to understand her vision better than the corporate executives who had been trying to buy her company for the past 6 months. I also know who he is, Margaret continued, pointing directly at Blackstone. I've been cleaning offices in this building for 15 years, and I've seen what happens to companies that get acquired by Richard Blackstone. He talks about growth and efficiency, but what he really does is gut companies and sell off the pieces. Blackstone's face was now purple with rage. This is outrageous. I will not sit here and listen to accusations from a janitor. Miss Santos, if you allow this disruption to continue, I'm afraid our offer will be withdrawn permanently. But Margaret wasn't finished. She had waited 15 years for this moment, and she wasn't going to be silenced by threats and intimidation. 3 years ago, Blackstone acquired a small catering company called Mama Rosa's Kitchen. It was owned by an Italian immigrant family who had been serving authentic home-cooked meals to the community for over 20 years. Sound familiar? Maria's eyes widened as she realized the parallel to her own situation. She leaned forward in her chair, completely focused on Margaret's words. Blackstone promised them the same things he's promising you, Margaret continued. Market expansion, technological resources, financial backing. The family signed the acquisition papers thinking they were securing their future and the futures of their employees. Within 6 months, Blackstone had fired all the original cooks, replaced the family recipes with mass-produced food made in industrial kitchens, and converted the operation into a generic delivery service with no soul or character. One of Blackstone's lawyers jumped to his feet. These allegations are completely unfounded and potentially libelous. I demand that this woman be removed immediately before she damages our client's reputation further. But Margaret continued speaking, her voice growing stronger with each word. The Rossini family lost everything. Not just their business, but their life's work. Mrs. Rossini had spent 40 years perfecting her grandmother's recipes. Mr. Rossini had hand-built the wood-fired ovens that gave their bread its special flavor. All of that was destroyed because Blackstone saw it as inefficient. Margaret reached into her cleaning cart and pulled out a worn manila folder that she had been carrying for months, waiting for the right moment to use its contents. I have documentation of everything. Financial records, internal memos, email communications. I've been cleaning these offices long enough to know how to pay attention to what gets thrown away and what gets left on desks. She opened the folder and spread several documents on the conference table, much to the horror of Blackstone's legal team. The papers included internal communications discussing the dismantling of acquired companies, cost-benefit analyses that treated employees as disposable resources, and profit projections that depended entirely on eliminating the human elements that made small businesses special. This memo, Margaret said, pointing to a specific document, discusses the optimization strategy for food service acquisitions. It explicitly states that the goal is to eliminate artisanal cooking operations and replace them with industrial food preparation. The projected cost savings come entirely from firing skilled cooks and replacing them with minimum wage assembly workers. Maria picked up the document and began reading, her face growing pale as she absorbed the clinical language describing the systematic destruction of everything she had worked to build. The memo talked about eliminating cultural authenticity barriers and streamlining ethnic food preparation processes, as if the very things that made her business special were obstacles to be overcome. This can't be legal, Maria said, looking up at Blackstone with disgust. You're basically planning to commit fraud by promising to maintain the integrity of my business while secretly planning to destroy it. Blackstone's composure was completely gone now. Those documents are confidential corporate materials. If this woman stole them from our offices, she can be prosecuted for corporate espionage. Miss Santos, I strongly advise you not to base any business decisions on illegally obtained materials. Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. I didn't steal anything. I just pay attention to what powerful people throw away when they think nobody important is watching. You'd be amazed what executives leave lying around when they consider the cleaning staff to be invisible. She pulled out another document, this one showing the financial performance of Blackstone's previous acquisitions in the food service sector. Every single company he's acquired in the past 5 years has followed the same pattern. Initial promises of growth and expansion, followed by massive layoffs, elimination of specialty services, and conversion to generic operations. The only metric that improves is profit margin, and that only happens because he destroys everything that made these companies worth acquiring in the first place. Maria studied the financial data, her business background helping her understand the implications of what she was seeing. These numbers show that employee satisfaction and customer retention both plummeted after each acquisition. How do you explain that, Mr. Blackstone? Business decisions are complex, Blackstone replied stiffly. Sometimes short-term disruptions are necessary to achieve long-term sustainability. The food service industry is highly competitive, and companies that fail to adapt to market realities inevitably fail. Margaret shook her head sadly. That's the same line he gave to the Rodriguez family when he acquired their Mexican restaurant chain. They had 12 locations across the city, each one managed by family members who had grown up learning traditional cooking techniques from their grandmothers. Blackstone convinced them that corporate management would help them expand to 50 locations within 2 years. She pulled out a newspaper clipping from her folder. 6 months after the acquisition, all 12 locations were closed. Blackstone sold the real estate to a generic fast food corporation and laid off every single employee, including family members who had worked in those restaurants for decades. The Rodriguez family lost not just their business, but their entire extended family's livelihood. The newspaper article included photographs of the shuttered restaurants and interviews with displaced workers who described the devastating impact on their families and communities. Margaret had been collecting these stories for years, documenting the human cost of Blackstone's business practices. "Why are you doing this?" Maria asked Margaret. "Why are you risking your job to warn me about this?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to explain the anger and frustration that had been building inside her for 15 years. "Because I've watched too many good people get destroyed by men like him," she said finally. "I've seen immigrant families lose everything they worked for because they trusted promises that were never meant to be kept. I've cleaned offices where executives laughed about how easy it was to manipulate small business owners who were desperate for capital." She looked directly at Maria with fierce intensity. "But mostly because I have a daughter who went through something similar. She spent 10 years building a small catering business that specialized in soul food recipes passed down from my grandmother. She employed 15 people from our neighborhood, all single mothers trying to support their families." Margaret's voice grew thick with emotion as she continued. "A company like Blackstone's approached her with promises of franchise opportunities and expansion capital. They convinced her to sign a partnership agreement that gave them control over her recipes and business operations. Within a year, they had replaced all her employees with cheaper workers, changed all the recipes to use industrial ingredients, and turned her grandmother's kitchen into a generic fast food operation." The room was completely silent as Margaret shared her personal story. Even Blackstone's lawyers seemed uncomfortable with the obvious pain in her voice. "My daughter lost everything," Margaret continued. "Her business, her employees' jobs, and, worst of all, her family's culinary legacy. My grandmother's recipes had been passed down for 4 generations, and now they're being used to make mass-produced food that has nothing to do with our family's tradition or our community's culture." She turned back to face Blackstone directly, her fear replaced by righteous anger. "So when I heard you using the exact same words and promises with Miss Santos that your people used with my daughter, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I won't let you destroy another family's dream just so you can add a few more zeros to your profit statements." Blackstone stood up abruptly, his silver hair disheveled, and his expensive suit wrinkled from the stress of the confrontation. "This meeting is over. Miss Santos, you have 48 hours to reconsider our offer. After that, the terms may be significantly less favorable." But before he could leave, Margaret pulled out one more document from her folder. This one was different from the others. It was a legal complaint that had been filed in federal court just the previous week. "You might want to reconsider your timeline, Mr. Blackstone," Margaret said calmly. "Because according to this lawsuit filed by the Rodriguez family, your business practices are under federal investigation for fraudulent acquisition practices and violation of small business protection laws." Blackstone's face went white as he recognized the legal document. His lawyers immediately huddled around him, whispering urgently about the implications of an active federal investigation. The lawsuit alleges a pattern of fraudulent business practices designed to deceive small business owners about the true intentions of acquisition agreements. Margaret continued reading from the document. "It seeks class action status on behalf of all business owners who were misled by Blackstone Corporation's deceptive practices." Maria looked at the legal filing with growing amazement. This lawsuit specifically mentions the tactics that were just used in this meeting. The artificial time pressure, the vague promises about maintaining business integrity, the complex financial projections designed to confuse rather than inform. Margaret nodded. "The federal investigators are very interested in documenting Blackstone's current business practices. They're particularly focused on any ongoing acquisition attempts that follow the same deceptive pattern described in the lawsuit." For the first time since the meeting began, Blackstone looked genuinely worried rather than just angry. Federal investigations could destroy his carefully constructed business empire, especially if they uncovered evidence of systematic fraud in his acquisition practices. "Miss Santos," Margaret said, turning back to the young entrepreneur, "you have every right to seek independent legal counsel before signing any agreements. You also have the right to take as much time as you need to fully understand the implications of this deal. Don't let anyone pressure you into making a decision that could destroy everything you've worked to build." As if on cue, security guards finally arrived at the conference room, summoned by Blackstone's earlier call. But the dynamic in the room had completely changed. Instead of removing an unwanted intruder, they found themselves in the middle of a tense business negotiation that had taken a dramatically unexpected turn. Margaret gathered her documents and returned them to her folder 2 hours after Margaret Williams had walked out of the conference room. Maria Santos found herself sitting in the building's quiet lobby, still processing everything that had happened. The marble floors gleamed under the soft lighting, and the late-night security guard nodded respectfully as Maria waited for the woman who had just saved her life's work from destruction. Margaret emerged from the elevator at exactly midnight, having finished her cleaning rounds for the night. She had changed from her work uniform into a simple but neat dress, and Maria was struck by how different she looked outside the context of her janitorial duties. This was clearly a woman with depth, intelligence, and hard-earned wisdom that went far beyond her job title. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come down here," Margaret said as she approached Maria's chair in the lobby seating area. "I almost didn't," Maria admitted honestly. "Part of me is still trying to process what happened up there. You basically saved my company, and I don't even know your name." "Margaret Williams," she replied, settling into the chair across from Maria. "And I think what happened tonight was just the beginning. Blackstone isn't going to give up easily. Men like him don't like being exposed, and they certainly don't like being challenged by people they consider beneath them." Maria nodded, her business instincts telling her that Margaret was absolutely right. His threat about changing the terms of the offer in 48 hours, that wasn't just posturing, was it? "No," Margaret said grimly. "He's probably already making phone calls to find other ways to pressure you. Maybe threatening your suppliers, or trying to poach your key employees, or spreading rumors about financial instability. That's how corporate predators operate when they can't get what they want through normal channels." The two women sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding the gravity of the situation they now found themselves in. Maria had been saved from making a terrible mistake, but that salvation came with new challenges and dangers. "Can I ask you something?" Maria said finally. "You could have lost your job tonight. You still might lose your job. Why did you take that risk for someone you'd never even met?" Margaret looked out through the lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. "Because 15 years ago, when my daughter was going through her business troubles, I wished someone had warned her about what she was getting into. I wished someone who knew the truth had been brave enough to speak up before she signed those papers that destroyed her dream." She turned back to face Maria directly. "I've been carrying that regret for 15 years, watching the same thing happen to other families, other entrepreneurs, other dreamers. Tonight I finally had the chance to do what I should have done for my daughter. I couldn't live with myself if I let another young woman make the same mistake." Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes as she understood the depth of sacrifice that Margaret had made for her. "Your daughter, what happened to her after she lost her business?" "She tried to rebuild for a couple of years," Margaret said sadly. "But the stress and the financial losses took a toll on her health. She developed anxiety and depression that she's still dealing with. She works as a line cook now at a chain restaurant, using other people's recipes instead of the family traditions she grew up with. The worst part is that she blames herself for trusting the wrong people." Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. "That's why what you're doing with Familia Foods is so important. You're not just running a business. You're preserving culture, supporting families, and keeping alive the traditions that make communities strong. People like Blackstone see that as inefficiency, but people like us know it's the most important thing in the world." Maria reached across the space between their chairs and gently squeezed Margaret's hand. "I'm so sorry about what happened to your daughter, but her loss doesn't have to be meaningless. Because of what she went through, and because of your courage tonight, hundreds of immigrant families are going to keep their livelihoods. That has to count for something. I hope so, Margaret said quietly. I really hope so. They were interrupted by Maria's phone buzzing with notifications. She checked the screen and frowned. Text messages from 3 of my board members, 2 missed calls from my lawyer, and an email from someone I've never heard of who claims to represent interested investors. Word travels fast in the business community. Margaret leaned forward with concern. What do the messages say? Maria read through them quickly, her frown deepening. My board members are asking for an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. My lawyer wants to know if the federal investigation Margaret mentioned is real, and whether I could face legal exposure for walking away from Blackstone's deal. And this mysterious investor is offering to discuss alternatives to my current business challenges. The vultures are already circling, Margaret said with disgust. This is exactly what I expected. When word gets out that you rejected Blackstone's offer, every corporate raider in the city is going to see you as a vulnerable target. They'll assume you're in financial trouble and try to take advantage of your situation. Maria stood up and began pacing, her mind racing as she tried to process the implications. So rejecting Blackstone's deal might have just made me a target for every other predator in the business. How is that better than accepting his offer? Because now you know what you're dealing with, Margaret replied firmly. Tonight you were walking into a trap blindfolded. Now your eyes are open, and you can make informed decisions about how to protect your company and your community. Margaret also stood, and Maria was surprised to see the determination in her expression. This was not a woman who was content to fade back into invisibility after making such a dramatic intervention. Besides, Margaret continued, you're not facing this alone anymore. I may just be a janitor, but I've spent 15 years learning how these corporate power games work. I know who the players are, what their weaknesses are, and how they operate. That information has value. Maria stopped pacing and stared at Margaret with growing amazement. You're talking about helping me fight back against some of the most powerful business interests in the city. Why would you do that? You've already done more than enough. Margaret walked over to one of the lobby windows and looked up at the towering office buildings that surrounded them. Because I'm tired of cleaning up after these people. I'm tired of emptying their trash cans filled with the dreams they've destroyed. I'm tired of being invisible while they plan their next attack on honest, hard-working families. She turned back to Maria with fire in her eyes. I may not have a business degree or a law degree, but I have something they don't have. I have 15 years of inside information about how they really operate. I know which companies are in financial trouble, which executives are involved in questionable deals, which lawyers cut corners, and which accountants cook books. Maria felt a surge of excitement as she began to understand what Margaret was proposing. You're talking about turning the tables on them, using their own tactics against them. I'm talking about leveling the playing field, Margaret corrected. Right now they have all the advantages: money, connections, legal resources, information networks. But they've been doing their dirty business in front of me for 15 years because they assumed I was too stupid or insignificant to matter. They never considered that someone in my position might be paying attention and taking notes. Margaret pulled out her worn manila folder again, but this time she opened it completely, revealing dozens of documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. This isn't just information about Blackstone. I have material on dozens of corporate executives, legal firms, and business deals. I know who's been involved in fraudulent schemes, who's been avoiding taxes, who's been violating labor laws, and who's been misleading investors. Maria's eyes widened as she saw the scope of what Margaret had compiled. This is like a roadmap of corporate corruption in the city. How did you manage to gather all this without anyone noticing? People in power have a blind spot, Margaret explained. They literally don't see service workers as human beings capable of independent thought. I've been in boardrooms when executives discussed bribing city officials. I've seen documents outlining plans to manipulate stock prices. I've overheard phone conversations about destroying evidence of safety violations. She closed the folder and looked directly at Maria. The information in here could bring down some very powerful people, but only if it's used correctly. I've been waiting for the right opportunity, the right cause, and the right person to help make it count. Maria sat back down, overwhelmed by the implications of what Margaret was offering. You're talking about taking on the entire corporate power structure of the city. These people have unlimited resources to fight back. They could destroy both of us. They could try, Margaret agreed. But they've made one crucial mistake over the years. They've gotten lazy and arrogant. They've been getting away with these practices for so long that they've stopped being careful about covering their tracks. They never imagined that their cleaning lady might be building a case against them. Margaret sat back down across from Maria, her expression becoming more serious. I'm not suggesting we become vigilantes or do anything illegal. But what if we used this information strategically to protect other small businesses from falling into the same traps? What if we found ways to expose the truth about these predatory practices before more entrepreneurs get hurt? You're talking about becoming some kind of corporate whistleblower, Maria said slowly, beginning to understand the full scope of what was being proposed. I'm talking about using the truth as a weapon against people who have been using lies and deception to destroy honest businesses, Margaret corrected. The federal investigation of Blackstone didn't start by accident. It started because someone provided evidence of his fraudulent practices. I've been feeding information to investigative journalists and federal regulators for months. Maria stared at Margaret with new respect and understanding. You're not just a janitor who happened to overhear a meeting. You're an undercover investigator who's been building cases against corporate criminals for years. Margaret smiled for the first time since Maria had met her. I prefer to think of myself as someone who finally found a way to fight back. These executives think they're untouchable because they have money and connections. But they forgot that information is the most powerful weapon in the modern world. And they've been dropping that weapon right into my hands every night for 15 years. The two women spent the next hour discussing strategy and possibilities. Margaret shared details about Blackstone's financial vulnerabilities, his connections to other questionable business deals, and the growing federal investigation that threatened to expose his entire operation. She also provided information about other potential threats to Maria's business and offered insights about how to protect Familia Foods from future predatory approaches. As the night wore on, Maria began to see a path forward that she had never imagined possible. Instead of being an isolated entrepreneur fighting alone against corporate giants, she could become part of a broader effort to expose and combat predatory business practices. With Margaret's information and her own business platform, they could create a network of protection for small businesses and immigrant entrepreneurs. There's something I need to tell you, Maria said as their conversation began to wind down. Familia Foods isn't just my company anymore. Over the past 2 years, I've been quietly organizing the cooks and drivers into a cooperative ownership structure. They don't just work for me, they own shares in the company. Margaret's eyes lit up with understanding. That's brilliant. It means Blackstone wasn't just trying to buy your company. He was trying to steal partial ownership from hundreds of immigrant families without them even knowing it. Exactly. And it means that any future decisions about the company have to be made collectively, with input from all the families who depend on it for their livelihood. I can't make unilateral decisions about acquisitions or partnerships anymore, even if I wanted to. Margaret stood up and extended her hand to Maria. Miss Santos, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful partnership. You have the business skills and community connections. I have the inside information and knowledge of how these corporate criminals operate. Together, we might just be able to build something that protects entrepreneurs like you from predators like Blackstone. Maria shook Margaret's hand firmly, feeling a sense of hope and determination that she hadn't experienced since starting her business. Margaret, I think you just changed my life for the second time tonight. But this time, instead of saving me from making a terrible mistake, you've shown me how to turn this situation into an opportunity to help other people avoid the same traps. As they walked toward the building exit together, Margaret couldn't help but smile at the irony of the situation. For 15 years, she had been invisible and powerless, cleaning up after the messes made by corporate executives. Now, she was about to become their worst nightmare, a knowledgeable adversary with access to their secrets and the determination to use that information to protect the very communities they had been exploiting. The night security guard nodded to them as they passed, having no idea that he had just witnessed the birth of a partnership that would soon shake the foundations of corporate power in the city. Margaret Williams, the invisible janitor, and Maria Santos, the idealistic entrepreneur, had found each other at exactly the right moment to begin a fight that would change everything for small businesses and immigrant families throughout the region. As they stepped out into the cool night air, both women knew that their lives had been permanently changed by the events of this evening. They had found not just an alliance, but a shared mission that would give new meaning and purpose to both of their futures, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. She had spent 15 years being invisible and powerless, but tonight she had found her voice and used it to protect someone who needed help. "My shift ends in an hour," she told Maria. "If you want to talk more about what you've learned tonight, I'll be in the building lobby. You deserve to know the full truth before you make any decisions about your company's future." With that, Margaret walked out of the conference room, leaving behind a group of stunned executives and one grateful young entrepreneur who was beginning to understand just how close she had come to making the biggest mistake of her life. Margaret knew things about Blackstone's business practices that even his own lawyers probably weren't aware of. She had cleaned his previous offices, had overheard phone conversations, and seen confidential documents that painted a very different picture of his successful acquisitions than the rosy narrative being presented to Maria tonight. As she reached for the door handle, Margaret took a deep breath and steeled herself for what she was about to do. She knew that interrupting this meeting could cost her job, could potentially result in legal trouble, and would certainly make her enemies among some very powerful people. But she also knew that she would never be able to live with herself if she let Maria sign that contract without understanding the full truth about what she was getting into. The door opened with a soft click, and Margaret stepped into the conference room. Every head turned toward her in surprise, and the room fell completely silent. Blackstone's eyes narrowed dangerously as he realized that their private meeting had been interrupted by what he clearly considered to be a menial employee. "Excuse me," Margaret said in a clear, steady voice that surprised even herself. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but you shouldn't sign that deal." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded, and Margaret could feel the shock waves rippling through the room. She had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and there was no going back now. Whatever happened next, Margaret knew that she had finally found the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences.